Start that you are Alice McGown, student in the environmental policy program here at the Middlebury Institute. Thank you so much, Alice, for joining us today and telling us about your time at COP26, presenting on behalf of the Leave It in the Ground initiative. As I was putting together your biography for the webpage announcing this, I was just impressed at your background. Not only are you someone who wants to change the world for the better environmentally, but you're an artist, a filmmaker, and you've had your hand involved in so many projects before coming to the Middlebury Institute, and I know afterwards. So very happy to have you presenting. Before you actually begin your presentation, we do like to start. This is the first open to the public event that we're having as part of the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Speaker Series. And I'd like to read a land acknowledgement as we start this series. So today we start with the land acknowledgement. Those of us who are physically in the Monterey Bay area, specifically the city of Monterey, this is the unceded territory of the Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen tribal nation. And those members are known as Esselen, Carmeleno, the Monterey Band, the Rumsen, the Chalon, the Ohlone, and the Costanoan. And these are the indigenous peoples of the Monterey area. All enrolled tribal members have ancestors that are identified at the San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo mission and Nuestra Senora de la Soledad mission original records. We acknowledge the tribal government. We respect their spiritual roles today and their cultural, environmental leadership that they show today. So with that, thank you so much, Alice, for talking to us today about the Leave It in the Ground initiative that brought you there. And as I was mentioning earlier, I'm taking the Geospatial Information Systems class taught by Monica Galligan here at Middlebury Institute. And I believe that's how you got going in mapping and this type of technology. So I'm really curious to see how that plays in too. So thank you so much, Alice.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it all started with that class. I didn't want to take a class on Excel skills, so I took the GIS class, and here we are. Yes, so thank you again for having me. Yeah, we call this presentation Adventures in Glasgow. It's Glasgow, not Glasgow. I found that out the hard way in Glasgow. I don't recommend mixing that up. Yeah, so I was there this past November for the 26th conference of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I was there as it all started with an internship that I've now been at for a little over a year with the Leave It in the Ground initiative. And with that initiative, we developed a project, and I was eventually invited there to speak at the People's Climate Summit and also to speak with some national representatives, national parties that were actually at the conference as well. So it was a huge honor. I'm still kind of just pinching myself that it happened. So to really divide things up, to kind of give this presentation some structure, I'm going to talk briefly first about just the map itself, the project. I'll talk a little bit about the actual policy process that happens at a COP, at a conference of parties. I'll talk a little bit about life at COP. It was, with the pandemic and everything, it was definitely an unusual occasion. And then I'll just forward just a few thoughts on the actual outcomes at COP. Like, what is this all for? Yeah, so to jump into the project, the map that went to Scotland, this project was entitled Fossil Fuels Under Protected Areas. And that's what we were trying to do, is build a map and quantify the amount of fossil fuel reserves that are under the world's protected areas. And so as of the February update, I'm currently tracking a little over 20% of land of arable land as being protected. There's a big push to get to 30 by 30, the 30 by 30 push. So we're about 2/3 of the way there. Yeah, so I think this is definitely going to be an interesting space to watch. So why protected areas? Well, we've got biodiversity spots, protected areas, just really areas that are worth protecting. And that was kind of the biggest thing why we settled on legally protected areas, not areas, other effective conservation areas or things like that. We wanted areas where the national government had already decided and put in writing, hey, this is worth protecting. It seemed like a pretty good bar to have. And that's why we went with that. So this is what the map actually looks like. This map itself took about a week to process. And so anybody in the GIS class that sits there waiting on one of their geoprocessing tools to finish processing, I think we were waiting a little bit over a week for this one to come out. We can see in purple, the purple area is really interesting because those are coal deposits. And one interesting thing about this map is that there is no publicly accessible map of all the coal deposits in the world. There are publicly accessible ones for different regions, but in terms of a global map that brings them all in together, makes sure that compares different data sources, adjusts for them, and it just didn't exist before this. We spent about a year building just the purple splotches you see on the map, because of very many reasons. It just doesn't exist. So that's a data set that we're really excited about. The orange bits are oil and gas deposits. That data set comes from our own United States Geographic Survey, USGS service. And then as we look at the red spots, those are actually the areas that we're really concerned with. Those are protected areas that have oil and gas deposits, fossil fuel deposits underneath them. And so we consider those to be areas that are at risk of being developed, protected areas that are at risk. So we have tons of different statistics, but the one that I like to always pull out is that we're looking at a little over 100 gigatons of potential CO2 emissions under the world's protected areas, which that's like game over for climate change. So, and especially as we're going to start to say in different to begin to lessen or wind down extraction operations, well, these protected areas are a great place to start making those commitments. And a large part of our project was turning these protected areas into quantifiable potential CO2 emissions. This is also so that countries could potentially use it as part of their nationally determined contributions. So one of the more interesting parts of doing this work was we actually didn't just track areas, we tracked operations and extraction operations across these different areas. And so I kind of just developed this little list of the top most prolific operators for running extraction operations in protected areas. Now, Now this list, you'd think this would be like, okay, we'll get attacked for putting a list out of this, but we've actually based it on the industry's own consulting source, Rystad Energy, which does all of their work for the oil and gas industry. They're one of the top providers of this, sort of information. And so one of the things that I kind of found amusing was that we were using the industry's own data to track this. Santos is a Australian company. If we look back there, we can see in Australia a whole bunch of red. And if you're wondering who's operating in it, that is this company here, Santos. A lot of the other top ones, a lot of the other, I won't call them top contenders, but they're active in the North Sea. There's a lot of protected areas in the North Sea between Great Britain and Europe. And there's also a lot of extraction. So we can see the Polish companies, Norwegian companies operating there a lot. So this is what processing all of that looked like. I'm sure Cecilia and anybody else in the GIS class is having flashbacks, but I called this my summer vacation. This was my 2020 summer vacation. This is what the view looked like. But yeah, so that's enough about the project. we can jump into actually what happens at the Conference of Parties, or COP. Most of us have taken Professor Langholz's class on public policy, and he presents it as a Ferris wheel, the public policy Ferris wheel. Well, COP is no different. They have a Ferris wheel as well. And I kind of visualize it as essentially moving towards consensus. Generally, months, even years before each COP conference, the presidency and the various parties, the various country delegations, will be working on coming up with some sort of agreement. Once the conference actually starts, the COP president will present a draft of an agreement, what they would like to be the Glasgow Pact. Then from there, they take a stock. Okay, is everybody good with this? Up, down. Some countries are going to object or stage what they call interventions in UN speak. Other countries will speak in favor of it. Generally from there, they'll head back to the negotiating rooms, where the parties will begin to negotiate changes to that draft. Again, it's important to have a draft so that everybody has something to argue over. Once consensus is it's looking like they're reaching a stopping point, the president will present a new version of the draft. There'll be an overall stock taking, back to negotiating, and we just continue that process until we finally get to the consensus being, yes, this is the pact that we want, the Glasgow Pact. So what does that actually look like? Well, it looks like this. Over on the left, we can see some delegates from national delegations rushing from the negotiating rooms back to the plenary room. Up there in the right-hand corner, we can see the plenary room. This is where the presidency up there at the lectern is actually doing a stock taking of all the different countries. And then, of course, when they go back to the negotiating room, it looks a lot like the room down in the bottom left-hand corner. And that was the negotiating rooms, just on a personal basis, was absolutely fascinating to be in. You'd think that they would lock a lot of observers out of this, and definitely some of them they did. But it was surprising how much access I had with that registered observer badge to actually be in the room while the US and India are hashing out language on coal phase downs, and actually hearing both sides. It was very educational. So you may have gathered that the COP presidency is a rather important position. For Glasgow, the COP presidency was held by a British politician called Alok Sharma, and watching him work was really a masterclass in consensus making, and I'll just call it diplomacy with a capital D. His job was, in a sense, balancing all of these different interests. And I've kind of illustrated a few of them here. We have private capital, small island nations, least developed nations versus the industrialized nations. And kind of sitting at the nexus of all of this is the COP presidency. And I put Alok Sharma's image there, but really it's a whole team of, in this case, British diplomats, because Britain had the presidency this year. And so a lot of what he's doing is taking the temperature of these different groups, seeing where they are, proposing that new pact, that new agreement, and then just kind of keeping the wheel moving between all of these different parties and keeping everybody working together. So that's a lot about the policy process and the project, but what is it actually like to be at COP, right? Well, first off, it's just the I don't know to call it vibe of just being in the room, of walking through the hallways. The energy levels are so high. Everybody is on their game, and this you could see over on it mainly took place in a sports arena, which was kind of a fitting analogy, I guess you could make. But you could see, so we all saw the photographs of the globe spinning over the COP26 sign, but none of them actually showed you the zoomed out view with the empty stands in the background and all of that. So I just thought that was like an interesting point of view that you didn't really get to see on television very much. So every morning started with this, that test that you see right there. You have to register your test result and show it to them. That mask was on my face. That mask or another mask was on my face almost the entire time I was there. You just really live with that mask on 24/7. Holding COP during a pandemic, they were largely successful in keeping it from being a super spreader event. But yeah, it's the one bit of merch or swag that we got from the conference was a hygiene kit. So yeah, so another interesting thing of actually being there and walking through a lot of the booths is you realize not every country is going to come and present. Different countries are at different places in their green transition. I found myself absolutely taken by by Australia's booth, which you could see right here. They are still promoting direct carbon capture as a solution for climate change, and I thought that was just wacky. My favorite part of this is that you see the oil and gas being pulled out of the ground. It's blue, but then when it goes back into the ground, it's green. You see, it's solved. It's green now. If you don't even have something like that to talk about, then you talk about what you can. Qatar, which is definitely not a leader in the climate, in solving climate change. Their entire booth was about how sustainable their World Cup stadiums were going to be. So they had an entire booth showing their stadiums and the building materials and how the stadiums were built out of renewable materials and were eco-conscious, then completely ignoring everything else that Qatar is doing. Then going a little bit further down, you have countries that are not even going to really bother. Here is Pakistan's booth. And my favorite part about this booth is that you see some people gathered around watching a presentation on television. It's actually the cricket game. So I thought that to be pretty telling. Then you have countries that, and then you can have private companies that kind of just completely miss the mark. Here's Hellmann's mayonnaise, where they're showing you how they're solving food waste and climate change through their stand. And I found myself spending about 10 minutes just walking through this booth. I couldn't, it was too much. So before I got to all of that, I'd have to actually get to what they call the blue zone, which was the controlled area that only badged accredited delegates could go to. And with all the accommodation in the city being taken, I actually stayed with some Extinction Rebellion activists that were actually lived out in the country a little bit. So every day, you can't really see it, but it is raining in those first two shots. Every day started with walking a long distance to finally get to a bus, to finally get to a subway, and then finally get into the city center. And you're getting close because that's when you start hitting a lot of the activists. The COP welcomes climate criminals. I was really, really taken by how much pushback there is against carbon markets. There's so much talk about setting up carbon markets, and walking through the crowds outside, they were super focused on saying no to carbon markets. So that was an interesting angle and to see. You can kind of see in the background, that's the fence around the blue zone, around the protected blue zone. And up against the fence is where kind of all the life is. So as you pass through the security barriers that you see in the right-hand corner, here's some photographs from just the other side of that bench. But my favorite photograph is looking through the bars at the activists out in the street. But really what's actually fascinating is if you look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, the one with the security gates, you'll see a building in the background. And that building is the hotel that most of the national delegates stayed at. And you'll notice another thing about that building. It's behind the security cordon, which meant that most national delegations could go to and from the conference in their hotel without ever really seeing any activists at all. So this was a really, really effective exclusion that they did to make sure that activist voices were not being heard. They kept everything behind that cordon, and they made sure that to keep them just really, really, really separated. So once you get past all of that, you get to the Scottish Event Campus. It's, like I said, a big sports arena, actually. And inside, apart from the actual negotiations, there were just huge bevy of panels, workshops, presentations by various organizations, groups of countries, UN officials themselves. Quite a few. There was one that was just private interest, private businesses. And so there was just an absolute smorgasbord of information, and just trying to decide which ones to go to and which ones to miss was stressful. But I very quickly found myself drawn to the actual process, to steal a line from Hamilton, the room where it happened. And we can see here, this is the big plenary room. This was really where those decisions were being made. It's just, I found myself spending almost all of my time there or in the negotiating rooms, actually seeing diplomacy in action. You can see down there in the bottom right-hand corner, I've stolen the seat of the International Monetary Fund. And you can also see that they've got the little microphones, and it was so hard to not during one of the meetings just turn the microphone on for the IMF desk and be like, hello, the IMF would like to dedicate its full financial weight and power to confronting climate change. I so wanted to just push the button and say that, and then let them figure it out, but decided not to. Yeah, I found myself just taking absolutely just over the top notes. You know, I like this one note that I took, youth, the Secretary General says the youth are holding our feet to the fire, which was really interesting, seeing how well they had done at keeping them out and keeping them unheard and unseen. Anyway, so all of that negotiation back and forth, Ferris wheel spinning. And by Friday afternoon, it was looking like there was going to be no agreement. We were never going to get to that little whoop to actually get to the pact. That wheel is just going to continue spinning, and we're out of time. These screens, which normally have, events that are happening and they're showing the schedule, all of a sudden they all switch to this. This is what a stalemate looks like at a UN conference. This is how you know. And so when I went to bed that Friday night, after a couple of pints, more than a couple of pints, with some delegates from Trinidad and Tobago who just wanted to drink. I was for sure that the whole conference was going to end in stalemate. And what happened is that over the night, negotiations continued. The whole COP presidency team, I don't think, slept at all, because at 4 a.m. the next morning, there was another draft out and available for the final agreement. And in those final hours on Saturday was absolutely the calm and kind of orderly nature of the whole event completely broke down. You could see just people just scrambling out in the halls. Instead of going back to the negotiating rooms, everybody just bundled up and huddled up and started talking in the main plenary room. I found myself getting squeezed from both sides by the huddle that was forming between India and the India and EU chief negotiators, and like John Kerry and the Chinese chief negotiator. I was like, oh no, I'm actually too in the middle of this. I was getting squeezed out, so I had to go find another place to sit, but it was really quite chaotic. Then, as if by magic almost, the president got up and, the Alok Sharma took the lectern and said, I think we have an agreement. And what then followed was exciting, except it took 2 hours for everybody to actually say yes. So it's like exciting, boring, but things actually happened. And we actually did come out with a Glasgow Pact. And it really, really happened, I would say, on Saturday, all on that final Saturday. And I mean, like from midnight until, there was like 12 hours from midnight until noon when it really happened on Saturday. And when the whole thing was finished, I had so little time left in Scotland that I just went straight to the airport. So what actually happened? What is in this Glasgow Pact? Well, compromise. That is the big word I would put in bold, is compromise. Making this slide took quite a bit of time, because what is one side on one issue is a different side on a different issue. So on one side, we could say that there were the developed nations that wanted to avoid any talk of loss and damage payments to the developing world for climate change, because, and this is, I literally heard these words come out of John Kerry's mouth, they didn't want to write a blank check. Felt like they couldn't write a blank check, John Kerry's words, to the developing world for loss and damage payments. Meanwhile, the least developed countries and the small island nations wanted to see payments quickly start to deal with ongoing loss. This isn't something theoretical to them. This is happening now. So the middle ground, again, compromise, was to actually set up a work group to develop a loss and damage payment facility. So to meet both sides' demands, they're going to go and actually start the rulemaking for what those loss and demands are going to be. The developed world is not going to get to, industrialized world, whatever you want to call it, is not going to get to push that issue further down. But also the least developed world, a small island nations, nations that are being affected right now, they're not going to get money without a well-developed system being going through the UN system first. So that was the middle ground on that. A large argument, and this was another case where I was lucky enough to actually be in the room, was the talk about coal. So a lot of the more like Europe, and even so, a lot of the countries like Europe and countries that are moving away from coal rapidly really wanted to see a declaration to phase out coal, and which would have been amazing, because this is the first agreement to even mention doing anything about fossil fuel consumption. 25 COPs before, never happened. Now, there was the other side, which was primarily led by China and India, along with several African nations, South Africa, for instance, that wanted to see no commitment from developing nations to wind down their coal, their coal use. So what was going to happen? One side wants to phase out coal, one side wants to avoid commitment completely. That's how we got to the phase down coal language that everybody was but that many people in the media were so very upset about. That language almost wasn't in there. It's clearly not all that we need, but there was almost no mention of phasing down, phasing out, phasing anything with fossil fuels in the final agreement. So we'll take that as a victory. Then on the final side, we had one side that wanted to see new nationally determined contributions, countries' commitments to reduce emissions every year until we've reached a 1.5 outlook. In other words, instead of having these meetings every several years where everybody gets together and then makes commitments, nationally determined commitments that are not enough, and then waiting another several years to make another set of commitments, they wanted to see countries be forced to come back to the table every every year until we had gotten sustained, workable commitments from them. Then there was the other side, the US primarily actually, that wanted to stick to the original 5-year interval in between those commitments. They argued that without an interval between it, it didn't give countries time to ratchet up their commitments. So how do we solve that? Well, the middle ground, again, the compromise was to require new nationally determined contributions next year, and they're going to make the decision. So essentially, they've kicked that can a year. We are going to require new NDCs this year now. And then once those NDCs are in, they will decide, the new COP presidency will decide whether to stick to the original 5-year interval or to say another round of 1 year of commitments in the next year. And the next COP will be hosted by Egypt. So we'll see. Yeah. Oops, going backwards. All right, so yeah, oops. Okay, see that's still going. All right, so I just wanted to just finish by just thanking first and foremost the Center for the Blue Economy for making it possible for me to go on this adventure in Glasgow. I'd really like to thank the Leave It in the Ground organization. A little over a year ago, I got an email from them saying, we're not selecting you for our internship, but we've got this other little project that we think you might be interested in. And a little over a year ago, in a trip to Scotland, here we are. Also, just our data partners, Oil Change International, Nordend GIS, and the Frac Tracker Alliance, who were partners that I got to work with. And in fact, I'm actually currently an intern with the Frac Tracker Alliance. So it just keeps going. But yeah, thank you everybody for showing up. And I just encourage everybody to take that GIS elective because you never know where it'll go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. This was great. Oh my gosh, so much that we did not hear on the news. I did not know about the separation of the hotel, versus all of the protesters outside. That definitely was not represented. What an inside view. I really appreciate not only your work on the amazing project and the map and the data, which is so powerful and had never been collected before, and so powerful in a visual way, but also your inside scoop. I thank you. I felt like I was there. So now we'd like to open it up to questions. So anyone who is here that would like to ask a question of Alice about her project, about the outcomes, about what it was like, please feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. We're a nice little small group here today, so feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, and ask a question if you have one.
Hi, Alice.
Hey, I knew you had a question, and
I always have questions.
I'm glad to see you. This is great.
Yeah, well, somebody put it in the IEP WhatsApp chat, and I was like, you know what? I'm working right now, but damn, I'm going to show up for Alice. So my question is about like sort of demographics in terms of who was represented. And I mean, you touched on this for sure, but there was a lot of chatter, not all of it positive, or certainly much of it not positive, about who was going to get to go to COP and what, on in the middle of the pandemic. And, some people couldn't even travel because of restrictions in their countries. And, so I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about your sense of how significant you feel like that may have been, or I don't know, just anything around that.
Yeah, it's I think my answer will actually go back to that night that I was out drinking with at a Scottish pub with the representatives from Trinidad and Tobago. They had to fundraise to get to go. The national delegation for the country had to fundraise to attend. Their delegation is 4 people versus the United States, which I think brought over 60. And so, you know, when you walk into these rooms, those negotiating rooms, and you saw how many tables and chairs there are around them. You know, 60 people can take half of that right there. And so yeah, definitely that was an issue. You know, the more wealthy countries definitely were able to show up and roll hard, and there was that disparity, both in just the number of human bodies. The representatives from Trinidad and Tobago, they were actually not staying at that hotel because they couldn't afford to stay at it. They were staying at another hotel. So it's kind of funny. It was like one of the countries that's like the most like in tune with what Extinction Rebellion outside was, you know, raising a fuss about. We're the only people actually having to walk through, you know, having to interact with them on a daily basis. But yeah, you know, it's like most, I think, like most, you know, international diplomatic gatherings, in that countries that are well funded, you know, show up and roll harder, so to say. But what is really interesting is that in addition to the COP conference itself, there was this thing called the People's Climate Conference, the People's Summit for Climate Justice. And they, in many ways, were counter-programming so much of the conference itself. And they provided a lot of spaces for Indigenous activists. And they, but, you know, I'll show you this bowl right here that was brought to me by somebody who was representing a group from Guatemala. She was at the conference and she was selling these bowls so that she could eat while she was there. Like, so, I mean, I look at the disparity and just the fact that there wasn't, it's like there should be funding through the UN to ensure that this doesn't happen, that I don't feel the necessity to buy this bowl. Well, I mean, it's a beautiful bowl, but that she didn't have to come here with a whole bunch of things and her baby. She came with a baby and sell these knickknacks. I mean, during the conference, this one activist from Guatemala, she was on the Daily Show, and then in between that, she was selling these to fund her trip there. I don't know if that kind of answers the question at all, but yeah, so there definitely was much more of a talk and representation and respect and just room and air given to Indigenous and local people. But it wasn't at the COP conference, it was at the People's Climate Summit that was happening throughout the city. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, People's Summit for Climate Justice.
Wow, what a stark contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure COP26 does not stand alone in that disparity in global gatherings around the world.
Yeah, I just couldn't get over the fact that they had people that were coming to present that were just not supported.
Yeah. Well, the countries of Trinidad and Tobago are some of the most affected by climate change, of course.
Absolutely, yeah, and yeah, there's
Yeah.
like I said, there were more than a few pints that night, and partially because I think they were just so frustrated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who could blame them? I'd be in the pub having a dram or 7.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Really great question. Anyone else? Please feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question. A few more minutes. And if no one does, I would like to ask the project that you did with Leave It in the Ground. And that's interesting. It wasn't an internship. It was like you were turned down for the internship. This was a side project that then turned into all of this and is continuing to lead you on a professional path now with the fracking organization or anti-fracking organization. My question is, did any of those nations that you presented to actually agree to stop any form of fossil fuel extractions on their legally protected areas?
A few of them seemed almost surprised that that they were having extraction on protected areas, and they're like, "Whoa, who says it's protected?" I'm like, "Your country in 2005 made that a protected natural reserve." And then so that was kind of surprising to me when some countries are just like, "Yeah, we know." It's one of the things you realize, that the diplomats that are at these events, they all want to get an agreement. They want to get progress, but each one has like a little bubble of what is possible, what is politically feasible in their country. It's if John Kerry can't show up and say, we're going to shut down all coal production tomorrow because, West Virginia would would blow up. And so you realize that like every diplomat, they're interested, they want to look for consensus and find consensus and work together. I mean, I saw the US and Venezuelan officials talking to each other even, and because they're professional diplomats. So definitely that was interesting, giving a presentation to diplomats with a capital D, where they're not very they're not confrontational in the way that you would kind of think. So some countries, they almost seemed a little surprised by the fact that they had protected areas that had extraction in them. Other countries, they're like, yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. The most surprising aspect that I found was countries' interest in knowing how much potential CO2 was under their protected areas. They were really interested in that number, because that comes back to, again, those nationally determined contributions. We commit, a country will say, we commit to avoid this many, this amount of CO2 emissions. So they're interested in banning, or stopping extraction in their protected areas, but they're really interested in what that number can do for their NDCs. And so you could say that this is kind of sly and like not great in the fact that they'd be like, oh, so if we just these protected areas, if we just say that they're off limits, then we can continue to let all this other stuff go on. You see, so it's like it can become like, a commitment that they make for an area that they weren't planning on extracting anyway. But now they have a nice shiny number that they can attach to that area, add it to their nationally determined contribution, and bam, progress. So we're a little bit worried about that. We're also worried about the fact that in some countries, there's oil and gas under that protected area, not protected anymore. And so that was a major consideration that we thought about, and we decided to go ahead with legally protected areas, focus on legally protected areas, because these are areas that, despite all of that, countries have still left listed. And so, yeah, Iran was a country that was particularly good at that. You look at the map for Iran and you'll see a nature preserve, and then you'll see a hole or a block that is not part of the nature reserve, in the middle of the nature reserve. You zoom in, oh yeah, those are oil derricks, yeah. So in that way, they fixed it. Again, there's a whole bunch of sly little ways that countries, fix things. Yeah, so that was really in response to that question, like the most surprising response from the national delegations was they were really interested in this idea that they could bolster their NDCs, their commitments, their nationally determined commitments for emissions reductions through protected areas. And so, and until somebody actually like put the idea that, hey, there could be an actual real number attached to non-extraction in these numbers in terms of potential CO2 that hasn't happened, that's being mitigated. That like all of us, like I think that's definitely got some wheels turning. But I'll be interested to see how much of it is in addition to other NDC commitments they make, and how much of it will be in as a replacement for, shutting down that coal mine, on the other side of the country.
That you raise a really good point that, from this project and every project that any environmentally, policy person or any activist really needs to keep in mind in terms of those possible alternate outcomes that are unintended and maybe even damaging to what you're trying to do. So I really appreciate that you brought those up. What was it, a specific set of countries, or like what countries should I be watching for in terms of how they then take this information? Or was it did you have delegates from everyone at COP?
I mean, we did not have delegates from everyone at COP. A lot of the big countries, the EU, most of the EU countries skipped it. We had a lot of the smaller countries come. We had delegates from Africa, Eastern Africa, Liberia, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, a lot of those countries there, which was really interesting because especially on the west coast of Africa, you see a lot of offshore extraction. It's prolific. So yeah, I was really surprised to see that. And those are also some of the countries that were the most interested in seeing what quantifying the CO2 potential CO2 emissions in their protected areas would mean in terms of like helping them meet their NDC commitments. So yeah,
thank you so
other
much.
countries, like, I mean, I remember Uruguay. Yeah, it was Uruguay. I think the delegation was like, no, like there's no extraction in protected areas. And I'm like, well, we kind of cross-reference this from 5 different data sources. And then I even zoomed in on Google Maps, and that area is definitely, it's what the way you could like zoom it, but it's like, you don't do that in those meetings. You're like, oh, okay. And you move on to the next person because it's just, try not to start arguments.
The naming and shaming goes so far, but not too far.
Yeah. And again, that's like the most prolific operator, Santos. They're an Australian-based company that primarily works in Australia. And so what do we do as an international, what do we do internationally on the international stage to address that? Santos doesn't care what I think about them. No, it's so yeah.
That list was really something.
And again, and it's like in a protected area, not all areas worth protecting are necessarily legally protected. And so as we look forward in the future of this work, there's a lot of talk about taking actually like officially designated biodiversity hotspots, Ramsar sites, which are generally set through an international commission, and giving a lot more weight to those. And then there's, of course, there's also talk about looking at other effective conservation measure areas. But again, this stuff gets a little bit more tricky because a national government may say, okay, that town's decided to protect that area, but we don't have anything to do with it. And we're trying to, again, work with national governments and also a lot of the activists. We're providing data that's a lot of the work that's been in the last few months, is providing data to activists and stakeholders in various countries. We've been working with some people in Mexico. We've worked with people in Angola and South Africa. And we're about to start working with some people in the Middle East, which will be a really, really interesting thing. So it's
work goes on. That's great.
Yeah, it's really gone on. And in fact, since COP26, I've probably, the amount of hours that I've dedicated to this has increased, and I'm actually now on their payroll, just doing this GIS work.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I think we have time for one more question if anyone wants to jump in. And if not, there's no harm in ending a little early.
I'm just excited to see some friendly faces.
Yeah, good. Oh, well, thank you so much, Alice. This was really great. Very, very educational for me. And yeah, really thank you for your commitment to this and your commitment to putting in those hours, you know, which were unpaid for the whole time that you were ramping this map up and collecting this, you know, first ever data set and creating that map. I mean, the amount of hours, as I'm just dipping a toe into this mapping, you know, the geospatial GIS program is amazing. So I can only imagine how many hours of your life, your summer vacation view.
Rachel, that my advice to other students would just be the next, if somebody ever pitches you a project that has a word like international, worldwide, or global in it, like think twice about it, because that's a lot. The world is really big.
Good warning, well heeded, I'm sure, by this crowd.
When you're 3 days into running a geoprocessing task and you realize, oh no, this is going to the wrong geo database, and you have to start.
Oh my gosh. And
Like
then when it was,
there are no short calculations. Like the short calculations are like go out and get lunch. So
oh my gosh. And then 7 days for that final everything.
although that processing, I think, was it was in late September when we were having a bit of a cold snap, and let me tell you, the computer kept my room warm.
Bonus.
I guess so. It's like a heater, but it spits out a map at the end.
I love it. All right, well, we shouldn't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for your time today. And everyone else, I'll be processing this video and putting it up on our environmental speaker series website. So it'll be there for later. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for the Center for the Blue Economy. It's donors and just the entire MIIS community. You know, before I came to MIIS, I wouldn't have imagined doing anything like this, and so I'm feeling pretty well supported here. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Rachel.
Oh, sure. That's great. That's great. Okay, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Elizabeth.